The last sound Caleb expected to hear that Tuesday afternoon was the crack of a judge's gavel sealing his fate for a crime he didn't commit. But perhaps even more unexpected was what that sound would teach him. That justice, like the intricate timepieces he spent his life repairing, could be broken. And if it could be broken, it could be fixed. This is the story of a watchmaker who became a prisoner who became a lawyer, and a lawyer who discovered that sometimes you have to lose everything to understand what justice truly means. Before the silence, Caleb's world was a universe of quiet, intricate sounds. The soft click of a tiny gear slotting into place, the gentle whir of a spring uncoiling, and the final, triumphant, steady heartbeat of a watch brought back to life. His workshop was a small, dusty sanctuary, smelling of old brass, oil, and the faint, clean scent of polished wood. Here, under the focused, golden glow of a watchmaker's lamp, he was not a man, but a surgeon of time. His hands, steady and patient, moved with a preternatural grace, navigating the miniature, mechanical landscapes within old timepieces. He didn't just fix watches, he restored their stories. He would hold a broken, forgotten heirloom, its hands frozen at the moment of some past trauma, and he would gently, methodically find the single hidden flaw, the bent tooth on a gear, the speck of dust in the mechanism, and he would make it right. His philosophy was simple. Everything, no matter how broken, had an internal logic. Chaos was just an order that had not yet been understood. He found a deep meditative peace in this work. The loud, hurried world outside his shop window, with its chaotic traffic and impatient crowds, was a puzzle he had no interest in solving. His world was here, in the quiet, predictable, and beautiful mechanics of a well-made machine. He was a man who believed that if you looked closely enough, with enough patience, the truth of any system would reveal itself. He was a man who believed in a world that made sense. The end of his world came on a Tuesday afternoon. He had left his workshop to deliver a restored antique clock to a client, a rare trip into the city's bustling downtown. He was walking down a crowded street, the heavy clock carefully cradled in his arms, his mind already back in the quiet sanctuary of his shop. And then chaos erupted. A blur of motion in an alleyway, a shout, the sound of a scuffle. He stopped, a moth drawn to a flame, and saw two figures struggling in the shadows. A moment later, one of them fell, and the other ran, sprinting out of the alley and directly into the panicked, scattering crowd. Caleb stood frozen, his heart pounding, the clock in his arms suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. He had seen the man's face for only a second, a fleeting glimpse of desperation and fear. Before he could process what had happened, the street was flooded with the sound of sirens. The police arrived, their movements sharp and efficient. They were looking for a suspect, and in the confusion and the conflicting accounts of panicked witnesses, their attention fell on him. The man standing alone, looking shocked, holding a large, heavy object. It was a grotesque, surreal inversion of reality. He, the quiet observer, the man who lived his life on the periphery, was suddenly thrust into the violent, chaotic center of the story. His protests of innocence were lost in the noise, his quiet, logical world collapsing under the brutal, illogical weight of a terrible mistake. The trial was a blur, a cold, impersonal machine that processed his life with terrifying efficiency. He was a small, broken gear caught in a mechanism far too large and complex for him to comprehend. His public defender was a young, overworked man with kind but tired eyes who seemed to be fighting a dozen other battles at once. The prosecutor was sharp, ambitious, and skilled at weaving a narrative of guilt from the thin, circumstantial threads of evidence. Caleb's own testimony, his quiet, precise explanation of events, sounded flimsy and weak in the face of the prosecution's confident, aggressive storytelling. He watched as if from a great distance as his life was taken apart, examined, and reassembled into a story in which he was the villain. He sat in the defendant's box and felt like one of the broken watches on his bench, his inner workings exposed, his purpose lost. The jury, a panel of anonymous faces, looked at him not as a man, but as a problem to be solved. And then came the verdict. Guilty. The word did not feel real. It was a sound without meaning, but the sound that followed was one he understood with a devastating, soul-crushing clarity. The sharp, definitive crack of the judge's gavel. It was the sound of a mainspring snapping. It was the sound of time itself breaking. The man whose life had been dedicated to the steady, rhythmic beat of time had just had his own stolen from him, sentenced to 7 years of a silence he could not fix. The transition from the theoretical injustice of the courtroom to the brutal, physical reality of prison was a descent into a new kind of hell. The world of quiet precision Caleb had known was replaced by a world of loud, unpredictable violence. The delicate scent of oil and wood was replaced by the smell of antiseptic, sweat, and a pervasive underlying scent of despair. His hands, once instruments of creation and restoration, were now clumsy and useless, kept clenched at his sides to protect them from the harsh, abrasive environment. He was no longer a watchmaker. He was inmate #734, a number stripped of all identity, a ghost in a gray uniform. The first few months were a slow, grinding death of the spirit. Hope, a delicate mechanism, was the first thing to break. The intricate, logical world he had believed in was a lie. There was no order here, only a raw, primal struggle for survival. He kept to himself, a silent, solitary figure, his eyes, once sharp with focus, now dull and downcast. He felt his mind, his greatest asset, beginning to atrophy in the crushing monotony of prison life. The quiet artisan, the man who could find the soul in a machine, was fading, being replaced by a hollowed-out shell, a man who was already serving a life sentence, regardless of the number of years the court had decreed. In the 3rd month of his sentence, desperate for a refuge from the ceaseless noise of the cell block, Caleb discovered the prison library. It was not the grand, sunlit sanctuary he had sometimes visited in the city. It was a small, forgotten room, smelling of damp paper and neglect, its shelves filled with tattered, dog-eared paperbacks. And it was here that he met Elias. Elias was a lifer, an old man who had been inside for more than 30 years, and who had carved out a small kingdom for himself as the prison librarian. He was not a man of many words. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy of motion, his face a roadmap of a life that had been lived and lost. He was a silent philosopher of the system, a man who had seen thousands of men like Caleb come and go. Elias watched Caleb for weeks. He saw the way Caleb would run his fingers over the spines of the books, not as a reader, but as a craftsman assessing the quality of the construction. He saw the flicker of the old intelligence behind Caleb's vacant, hopeless eyes. One afternoon, as Caleb was aimlessly browsing the shelves, Elias approached him. He didn't offer words of comfort or hollow advice. Instead, he pressed a heavy, worn book into Caleb's hands. It wasn't a novel or a book of poetry. It was a thick, intimidating legal textbook, Introduction to Criminal Procedure. "If you're going to be a prisoner," Elias said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper, "you might as well learn the language of your captors." At first, Caleb rejected the book. The law was the machine that had broken him, the source of his pain. To study it felt like a form of self-torture. He left the book on the small table in his cell, a monument to the injustice that had consumed his life. But in the long, silent hours of the night, its presence began to taunt him. And one night, driven by a mixture of boredom and a desperate need for intellectual stimulus, he opened it. The language was dense, filled with jargon and complex clauses. But as he read, something began to shift in his mind. His watchmaker's brain, dormant for so long, began to stir. He started to see the law not as an arbitrary, malevolent force, but as exactly what Elias had called it, a language, And more than that, he saw it as a machine. A vast, complex, and deeply flawed machine filled with intricate gears, delicate levers, and hidden counterweights. He saw the procedures, the precedents, the loopholes. He saw it not with the eyes of a victim, but with the cool, analytical gaze of a craftsman. And for the first time in months, a flicker of something that was not despair ignited within him. It was a spark of pure intellectual curiosity. He realized with a clarity that was both terrifying and exhilarating that if the law was a machine, then it could be understood. And if it could be understood, it could be dismantled. And if it could be dismantled, then perhaps, just perhaps, it could be beaten. The spark of curiosity ignited in Caleb's cell grew into a consuming fire. The next 7 years of his life were not a sentence to be endured, but a monastic, obsessive education. His prison cell became his university, the narrow cot his study carrel. The prison library, once a refuge, was now his laboratory. Under the quiet, watchful eye of Elias, he devoured every legal text he could get his hands on. He became a master of the prison's informal economy, trading his rationed food for extra time in the library, his skills as a repairman for access to newer legal volumes brought in by sympathetic guards. He read until his eyes burned, his cell walls slowly disappearing under a tapestry of handwritten notes made on scraps of paper, on the backs of envelopes, and, when nothing else was available, on squares of coarse toilet paper. His mind, once focused on the delicate microscopic world of watch gears, now expanded to encompass the vast labyrinthine machinery of the law. He studied constitutional law, criminal procedure, the rules of evidence. He learned the language of his captors until it was as familiar to him as his own name. He was no longer just an inmate. He was a scholar, a legal theorist, a man on a singular, relentless quest for knowledge. The other prisoners, who had at first seen him as a quiet, aloof victim, now watched him with a mixture of awe and confusion. They saw the light burning in his cell late into the night, the feverish intensity of his study. They didn't understand what he was doing, but they recognized the look of a man who had found a purpose in a place where all purpose was meant to die. His reputation began to spread through the prison's grapevine, a whisper that started in the library and echoed through the cell blocks. It began with a single case. A young inmate, barely out of his teens, was facing an extended sentence due to a procedural error on his paperwork. He was functionally illiterate, lost in a system he couldn't navigate. Seeing the boy's despair, Caleb offered to look at his file. With his watchmaker's eye for detail, he found the flaw in minutes. A missed deadline, a misfiled motion, a tiny overlooked gear in the machine that had thrown the entire case off balance. He helped the boy draft a simple, clear appeal. Weeks later, the boy's sentence was corrected. It was a small victory, but in the hopeless world of the prison, it was a miracle. Soon, others came to him. They came with their crumpled legal documents, their stories of incompetent lawyers and rushed plea bargains. They were the forgotten men, the ones who had been chewed up and spit out by the system, their lives reduced to a case number. Caleb became their last and only hope. He would sit with them in the noisy cafeteria or the dusty library, his head bent over their files, listening to their stories with the same patient focus he had once given to the ticking of a watch. He never made promises. He only offered his time, his knowledge. He wrote their appeals, drafted their motions, and taught them the language they needed to fight for themselves. He was becoming the cell block lawyer, a legend in the shadows, a man who was using the very system that had imprisoned him to chip away at its walls from the inside. All the while, he never stopped working on his own case. It was the most complex and personal mechanism he had ever attempted to dismantle. He spent years poring over his own trial transcripts, his memory of the events a constant, painful counterpoint to the cold, official narrative on the page. He dissected every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every procedural ruling. And then, in the 5th year of his sentence, he found it. It was not a dramatic, last-minute piece of exculpatory evidence. It was something far more subtle. It was a pattern, a series of small, seemingly insignificant procedural errors made by the prosecution, a consistent bending of the rules that, when viewed as a whole, pointed not just to a mistake, but to a systemic bias, a rush to judgment that had contaminated the entire trial. With Elias's help in navigating the complex appeals process, he drafted his final petition. It was a masterpiece of legal reasoning, a watchmaker's dissection of a broken system. He sent it out into the world, a message in a bottle from the depths of his prison. Months turned into a year, then 2, and then one ordinary morning, the warden called him to his office. A small, non-profit legal aid group, the Innocence Initiative, had taken up his appeal. His conviction had been overturned. He was a free man. The day he walked out of the prison gates, the sunlight on his face felt like a physical blow. He said his goodbyes to the men he was leaving behind, his clients, and as he shook the hand of his old, wise mentor, Elias, he made a solemn, unbreakable vow. "I'll be back for you," he said. It was not just a promise to one man. It was a promise to them all. The world outside was a loud, overwhelming, and alien landscape. 7 years in the muted grays and monotonous rhythms of prison had left Caleb unprepared for the chaotic, vibrant sensory assault of freedom. The speed of the cars, the colors of the advertisements, the sheer number of faces in a crowd. It was all a dizzying, terrifying spectacle. He was free, but he was also a ghost. The world had moved on without him. He carried the indelible, invisible stain of his past, a brand that marked him as an outcast. He was an ex-convict, a number in a database, and the doors of society, which had once been open to him, were now firmly shut. His dream of becoming a legitimate lawyer seemed like a cruel joke. He applied to law schools, his brilliant, self-taught legal mind hidden behind an application that began and ended with a single damning checkbox. Have you ever been convicted of a felony? Rejection letters piled up. He took on menial jobs, the same kind of work he had done in prison, just to pay for a small, barren room. The temptation to despair, to surrender to the bitterness that was his constant companion, was immense. But in his darkest moments, he would remember the faces of the men he had left behind. Elias, the young boy, the countless others who were still trapped in the machine. His promise to them was the anchor that kept him from being swept away by the currents of his own hopelessness. It was not just his dream he was fighting for, it was theirs. His breakthrough came from the one place that had taken an interest in his case, the Innocence Initiative. The small, underfunded nonprofit, impressed by the legal brilliance of his own appeal, offered him a paralegal position while he fought to get into law school. It was here that he found his new tribe. They were a small, dedicated band of idealists, young lawyers who believed in the principles he had discovered in the darkness of his cell. They saw not an ex-convict, but a man with a perspective so unique and powerful that it could change the very nature of their work. With their support, he finally gained admission to a small, unpretentious law school that was willing to take a chance on him. After graduating and passing the bar exam, a Herculean feat for a man with his record, he respectfully declined the organization's offer of a full-time staff attorney position. He knew he could not fight the system from within its established, respectable boundaries. He had to return to the world of the forgotten. He opened his own small, one-room office in the same blighted neighborhood where he had first lived after his release. The sign on his door was simple: Caleb Finch, attorney at law. His clients were not wealthy corporations. They were the voiceless, the marginalized, the people the system was designed to overlook. They were the men and women who reminded him of the faces he had known in C-Block. His first major case was a mirror of his own. It was the case of a man named Marcus, who had been in prison for 10 years for a robbery he swore he didn't commit. He had been convicted on the testimony of a single, shaky eyewitness, and had been represented by an overworked public defender who had only met him an hour before the trial began. The case had been declared hopeless by every other lawyer who had looked at it. But Caleb saw something they had missed. With his watchmaker's eye, he began to dismantle the prosecution's case, not by searching for a dramatic new piece of evidence, but by examining the mechanics of the original investigation. He found it in a dusty box of evidence logs in the courthouse basement, a small, overlooked discrepancy in the timing of the police report, a gear just a few millimeters out of place. It was a detail so minor that no one had ever noticed it. But Caleb knew that in a complex machine, the smallest flaw can cause the entire system to fail. He used that single, tiny inconsistency to unravel the prosecution's entire timeline, to expose the rush to judgment that had sent an innocent man to prison for a decade. The day Marcus walked free, his tearful reunion with his family broadcast on the local news, Caleb was not in front of the cameras. He was in the back of the courtroom, a quiet, unseen ghost, watching the beautiful, intricate machinery of a life being restored. He had fulfilled a fraction of his promise, and his work was just beginning. Caleb's victory in the Marcus case was a small, quiet earthquake in the city's legal landscape. It sent a tremor of hope through the desperate, forgotten communities he served, and a flicker of unease through the established halls of the prosecutor's office. He was no longer just a solitary lawyer in a rundown office. He was a symbol, a man who had walked through the fire of the system and had returned with a map of its deepest flaws. His small office was soon overwhelmed with letters from prisons across the state, pleas from families who had lost loved ones to the grinding, impersonal machinery of justice. He was just one man, a single watchmaker, trying to repair 1,000 broken clocks at once. He knew he could not do it alone. With the modest notoriety from his first win, he founded a new independent organization. He called it the Second Chance Project. It was not a charity, it was a workshop. Its purpose was to do for others what he had done for himself, to meticulously dismantle cases, to search for the hidden flaws, the overlooked details, the moments where the system had failed in its duty. He began to recruit, not from the top of the law school classes, but from the ranks of the hungry, the idealistic, the ones who still believed the law could be a shield for the powerless. Young, passionate lawyers, inspired by his story and disillusioned with the corporate legal world, were drawn to his quiet, intense sense of purpose. His small, cramped office became a bustling, hopeful hub, a workshop dedicated to restoring stolen time. One day, a letter arrived that was different from the others. It was not a desperate plea for help, but a quiet, academic inquiry from a law student. The student was researching a series of old convictions from a specific prosecutor's office during a specific 7-year period. The very same office and the very same period of Caleb's own conviction. The student had noticed a statistical anomaly, a pattern of unusually high conviction rates in cases that relied heavily on circumstantial evidence. As Caleb read the letter, a cold dread, a feeling he had not felt since his own trial, began to creep over him. He pulled the files from his own case out of a locked drawer, his hands trembling slightly. He and his small team began to dig. They spent months in dusty courthouse archives, poring over old trial transcripts, cross-referencing cases, looking for a common thread. And then they found it. It was a pattern, just as he had suspected in his own case, but far wider and more sinister than he had ever imagined. It was a consistent pattern of withheld evidence, of rushed forensic work, of an over-reliance on unreliable jailhouse informants. It was the signature of a system not just flawed, but corrupt. And at the center of this web, one name appeared again and again, the ambitious, ruthless prosecutor who had built his career on these questionable convictions. The man who had put Caleb away. The prosecutor was now the city's district attorney, a powerful, respected political figure, widely seen as a future candidate for mayor. For Caleb to challenge him would be to declare war, not just on a man, but on the entire political establishment that protected him. The fight moved from the courtroom to the public square. The DA, feeling the pressure, did not respond with violence, but with the insidious, surgical weapons of power. He launched a smear campaign, leaking details of Caleb's own prison record to the press, painting him as a disgruntled ex-convict with a personal vendetta. He initiated audits of the Second Chance Project's finances, trying to bury them in a mountain of bureaucratic red tape. It was a battle Caleb was not prepared for. He was a craftsman, a man of quiet logic and detailed analysis. He was not a politician, not a public speaker. He faltered in press conferences, his quiet, reasoned arguments drowned out by the DA's polished, confident denials. His organization began to lose funding, his young lawyers became demoralized. The machine, which he had fought on a case-by-case basis, was now turning its full, crushing weight against him. For the first time since his release, Caleb felt the cold, familiar grip of hopelessness. He had freed the men, but he had not fixed the machine, and now the machine was coming to destroy him. Just as the district attorney's campaign seemed on the verge of crushing him, something unexpected happened. The first man Caleb had freed, Marcus, had spent the past year rebuilding his life, working 2 jobs and reconnecting with his family. He had stayed out of the spotlight, but he had been watching Caleb struggle. He organized the other freed men and women, the dozens of souls the Second Chance Project had pulled from the wreckage of the system. They were not powerful or wealthy, but they had a currency that was far more valuable: their stories. They began to speak to the press, not with legal arguments, but with the raw, undeniable truth of their stolen years. They became a chorus of voices that could not be silenced, a living testament to the pattern of injustice Caleb had uncovered. The public narrative began to shift. The DA's polished denials began to look like the desperate stonewalling of a guilty man. The pressure became a firestorm. An independent investigation was launched. The story culminated not in a dramatic courtroom showdown, but in the quiet, ignominious resignation of the district attorney. It was a victory, but a bittersweet one. The true victory came in the months that followed, in a series of quiet, powerful moments. It came in a steady stream of exonerations, as the cases tainted by the DA's misconduct were re-examined and overturned. It was a montage of human emotion, of tears and embraces at the prison gates, of families reunited after decades of stolen time. Caleb was there for each one, not as a conquering hero, but as a quiet, steady presence, a man fulfilling a promise. The most significant of these releases was the last one. Elias, his old, wise mentor, was finally granted parole, his life sentence commuted in light of the systemic misconduct that had plagued his original trial. He was an old man now, his hair white, his steps slow, having spent more than 40 years behind bars. Caleb was there, waiting for him as he walked out of the prison gates for the last time. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic embraces. The 2 men, the watchmaker and the librarian, simply stood for a long morning in the quiet morning light, a lifetime of shared history passing between them in a single, silent look of mutual respect. "You did it, kid," Elias said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "You actually did it." "I told you I'd be back," Caleb replied, a small, weary smile on his face. He drove Elias not to a halfway house, but to a small, quiet cottage by a lake he had rented for him, a place where he could spend his final years surrounded by the peace of the natural world, a world he had only been able to read about in books for 4 decades. In that quiet act of kindness, in ensuring his old friend's final chapter would be one of dignity and peace, Caleb had finally fully repaid his debt. The final scene is not in a courtroom or a press conference. It is in Caleb's small, quiet workshop, the one he had finally allowed himself to rebuild. It is late at night. The city outside is a distant, muffled hum. The room is filled with the familiar, comforting smell of old brass and oil. Caleb is sitting at his watchmaker's bench, a single golden lamp illuminating his work. He is not working on a legal brief or an appeal. He is hunched over an old, intricate pocket watch, its back open, revealing the beautiful, complex universe of gears and springs within. His hands, the same hands that had drafted the legal arguments that had freed dozens of innocent souls, are once again moving with that old familiar grace. They are steady, they are patient. He makes a final delicate adjustment with a pair of tweezers. There is a soft, satisfying click. He holds the watch to his ear, and then he hears it. The quiet, steady, reassuring heartbeat of time, perfectly restored. He closes his eyes, a profound, lasting peace settling over him. He had not just fought the machine, he had mastered it. But he had discovered that true freedom was not in the grand public battle for justice, but here, in the quiet, humble act of restoration. He was a watchmaker again, a man who, after losing his own time, had dedicated his life to giving it back to others, one precious ticking second at a time.